Last spring, a couple friends of mine, Jack and Hans, were having a disagreement, and that disagreement was about buff spells. Jack was insisting that they're largely pretty bad and a waste of deck space in just about all formats, whereas Hans was passionately defending them as an underrated type of card. After the conversation was over, Hans, looking intensely off into space, simply said, "I need to make a buff spells deck now." And in the following weeks, he did just that. He went for teamer colors and built it dirt cheap. As it turns out, buff spells are quite inexpensive, even the good ones. He started with Paco and Halden as the commanders, which performed roughly as you'd expect for a $20 buff spells deck. It was a mediocre mid-range deck with some funky combat tricks, and Paco ate his fair share of removal spells. But then, Hans switched out the commander for a much spicier choice, Xyrus the Writhing Storm. Suddenly, the deck started performing very differently. Games with this version of Xyrus start off pretty unassumingly. The deck typically plays a ramp spell on some sort of value creature, turns 2 and 3, and then plays its commander, turn 4 or 5. From there, it typically ramps a bit more, plays another creature or two, and hits the person at the table who is doing the worst. Combat step with Xyrus generally sees Hans saying, "Who wants some cards?" And then, as promised, letting a person he's okay with drawing cards, along with himself, draw cards. If a player kept a risky hand and is getting flooded or screwed, Xyrus is here to save them, to bestow upon them the gift of 3 or 6 or even 9 cards. And this is the trap the deck lays, seeming like a friend. I have seen a mana-screwed player counter an opposing removal spell that targets Xyrus simply because they were desperate to keep drawing those cards. The deck is friendly and unassuming right up until the point where it starts deciding to stop being those things and start murdering players. Because, fun fact, letting you and an opponent each draw 15 cards is great when that opponent simultaneously dies to commander damage. Relevant to the way this deck operates in practice is the Small Bean Syndrome video I made a while back. Hans plays the deck totally straight. He doesn't emphasize the deck's power, nor its lack of power, but the deck nonetheless heavily plays on the perceptions of its opponents. The deck is pretty predictable if you stop and take a moment to think about it. It's about 20% buff spells, 10% protection spells, 10% removal spells, and an assortment of lands, ramp, and utility creatures from there. When you know how many cards the deck has drawn, you can guess the approximate composition of its current hand. Very little in the deck is fully unique. And if you were to think about this constantly, to realize that the deck is probably currently holding multiple protection spells, fight spells, and or buff spells at a given moment, and is going to get escalating numbers of those things on the coming turns, you might get worried about what the deck is doing, and correctly so. But nobody seems to do this sort of analysis. This deck gets underestimated game after game, and by people who have lost to it half a dozen or more times. Even I frequently find myself underestimating the deck, specifically because individual cards in the deck aren't very memorable. The deck's lack of spicy plays and absolute transparency in what it's trying to do in a given game play to its strengths. It effortlessly slides to the back of its opponent's mind as the pile of bulk commons that will draw them some cards, and it stays there until it's far too late. I say far too late because this deck operates more or less on the snowball principle. Early in the game, it doesn't have many buff spells, protection spells, or removal spells. However, as it accumulates cards from Xyrus hits, it has more and more resources to protect its game plan and stop other people, and by the time it has killed a player, it has access to basically whatever resources from its deck that it wants. In addition, the threat profile of the deck typically lags behind its actual power. At any given moment, people are usually concerned about the deck in the amount they should have been concerned about it a turn or two previously. However, despite not presenting as a deck the table should be worried about winning, the deck does cultivate a specific, more mundane type of fear in its opponents, a fear created directly from the act of running a lot of buff spells. The combination of the deck being 20% buff spells and it drawing a lot of cards gives an impression of an endless stream of buff spells. When it comes down to it, the deck's supply of buff spells is finite. It is spending resources to use them, and it does run out of them sometimes. But the deck's opponents nonetheless learn to exist in a constant state of fear during the combat step. Can I attack the Xyrus player with my 5/5 Trampler? No, they have a 1/1 snake they can block with. I don't want to lose my creature. Should I block that Catgeist? Well, no, of course not. Do I look like somebody who throws my threats in the garbage? This might seem like a minor factor, but like many other aspects of the deck, it's a dynamic that hinders its opponent's abilities to work together to slow it down. In theory, if a player is far ahead, you can make use of the multiplayer nature of the format. Two or more opponents trading cards 1 for 1 as blockers or through removal spells will wear down a deck over time. And if anything, this is more true in the case of opposing decks forcing Xyris to use buff spells outside of dealing combat damage to a player. The deck's happy place is when it pours 3 to 4 buff spells into killing a player with Xyris and restocking its hand, and every buff spell it uses on damage not being dealt to an opponent sets it back from getting to that place. But the impression of a never-ending tide of buff spells, paired with the deck's delayed threat profile, keeps opponents from playing this way in most games. The snakes Xyris creates bolster these characteristics, both the way the deck discourages its opponents from trying to engage with it during the combat step, and the snowball factor. Xyris creates a lot of snakes. Even if its opponents aren't running draw of any kind, it's still generating as many snakes as the commander deals damage to players. This means 3 per turn at minimum, and a dozen or more per turn once the deck hits its stride. The result of this compounds with the nature of being a buff spells deck. The deck gains piles and piles of potential attackers and blockers that could get larger and gain all manner of potentially problematic keywords at any moment. This also plays into the snowball factor. Once opponents catch on to how concerning the deck is, even if they manage to dump enough removal into the commander to break through the deck's protection spells, they're still going to have a lot of snakes to deal with. If there are enough of these snakes, they alone could be adequate to push through for the win, as the benefit of having a wide board of attackers means that the deck can pile buff spells onto the unblocked snakes, effectively creating a sort of evasion where the deck can decide to have a specific snake be its scary attacker after blockers are declared. The snake problem isn't impossible to overcome though, and one good way to shut it down is to play a board wipe. And actually, this can even be a good way to deal with the deck's commander as well, since of its 11 cards that could be considered protective, 5 of them are entirely useless against board wipes, and the other 6 are only situationally useful. So are board wipes this deck's Achilles heel? Kind of, but not exactly. And to explain why, I need to talk about the ways decks store accumulated resources. Most commander decks tend to have some focus on building up resources, and a key question is what the deck does with those resources to push its advantage, but also avoid losing them all. That key question's answer is the Azuri-Kyler scale of accumulated resource permanency, trademark pending. Basically, Planeswalker emblems and experience counters are the most permanent type of resource, as something that opponents literally can't interact with, generally followed by lands, cards in hand, a variety of different non-land permanents, and a single type of non-land permanent, with creatures whose presence on the board holds up the deck's entire game plan, such as Kyler or Chainer, generally being the most vulnerable way to store resources. The Xyris buff spells deck is among the decks that treat cards in hand as their primary place to store resources, but these decks differ widely, with one axis of difference being especially key: velocity. Control decks, combo decks, and a decent portion of high curve to mid-range decks will place high value on the stuff they have in their hand, but they generally play that stuff slowly. Their turnover of the stuff in their hand is pretty low, an attribute we could call being low velocity. By contrast, Xyris buff spells is a very high velocity deck. Buff spells can essentially be thought of as creatures that only cost a fraction as much, but stick around for a single turn. And in later turns, the deck will often churn through 5 or more of these per turn. The result of this is that Xyris buff spells will be somewhat resilient to board wipes, since most of Xyris' power is stored in the deck's hand, and it can rapidly play them out on the next turn it has a creature to swing with. However, its high velocity also means that if the deck's draw is cut off multiple turns in a row, or if it loses Xyris at a moment where it's already low on buff spells, it will struggle to get back on its feet quickly. With this weakness in mind, I feel I should clarify what I mean when I call this my Playgroup's best deck. This isn't a deck that generally dukes it out with high-powered combo decks. It would have a hard time in those games. No, this is a deck that gets pulled out in low to medium power games. On paper, it's Hans' least powerful deck. And I think it shouldn't go understated just how unassuming this deck seems, even having seen it in action. It's mostly bulk commons, it's pretty dependent on the commander, it's not very fast, the mana base is almost entirely basics and tap lands, and its core category of card is usually relegated to being played in limited, and maybe the fastest of aggro decks. This deck doesn't seem very good, and that perception is exactly what makes it so good, what causes it to win the vast majority of games it's featured in. The deck absolutely could be improved in terms of its raw power level, especially with another $20 to $30 in budget. It could run a couple more counterspells. It could run some protective equipments. It could run better ramp. And most importantly, it could run 2 to 3 cards that give unlimited hand size, which would, on paper, eliminate one of the deck's key weaknesses. But here's the thing. Doing those things would turn this deck into a more generic Voltron deck, one that is obviously threatening and a very visible ticking time bomb for everybody at the table, as long as Xyrus is in play. I've argued in the past that Reliquary Tower is overrated, and this is a strange case where it actually would be quite good from a power level standpoint, and yet it's still correct not to include it. Discarding to hand size is the final dynamic that causes people to underestimate the deck. If the deck has a fistful of 10 or 15 or even 20 cards, it's obviously a threat. But when you watch the deck discard back down to 7, you have to ask yourself, come on, how good could that hand possibly be? And in this case, you wouldn't even be wrong to ask that. There are only so many protection spells and buff spells and other types of spells that a 7-card hand can contain, and the deck does need to balance inflicting lethal combat damage with protecting the commander and retaining the ability to deal with opposing threats. In this way, not running unlimited hand size cards makes the deck more interesting to play against, and also more interesting to play. In later turns, the discard phase becomes a critical decision point, where the Xyrus player must carefully plan out their resources and try to navigate around what their opponents are trying to do. It's like a turn-based boss fight where the boss needs to carefully allot resources in order to best ward off the encroachments of the other players. It's honestly really cool, and it's kind of hard to ever be mad at the Xyrus deck for this reason, even as it tends to pull off wins in the end regardless. Paradoxically, the Xyrus buff spells deck has the highest win rate of any deck in my playgroup because of how dynamic and how fair it is. The deck is a masterclass in playing Commander in the purest sense. It does a good job of creating interesting gameplay for everybody at the table, and that interesting gameplay itself greatly contributes to its ability to win games. Thanks for watching. I had planned to release a video about navigating power levels this week, but I couldn't quite get the script where I wanted it in time, so I decided to make this video instead. You can expect that power level video next week, though. I will also be posting an endnote to this video tomorrow over on my Patreon that discusses a particular deck building style that was used in making this deck, so if you aren't giving me money yet, now is a pretty cool time to start.